Very good. Well, I make it 2 minutes past, so I think it's probably time to make a start. A very warm welcome from me, first of all, Monica Bohm-Duchen. As some of you will already know, I'm the founding director of the Insiders Outsiders project, which in the first instance was set up to celebrate and look at in a more nuanced and detailed kind of way the huge and pervasive contribution of those who found sanctuary here from Nazi Europe to this country's culture. But as a kind of natural corollary of that, natural sort of offshoot, has been an increasing interest. I've always been there. I'm a second generation member myself, but actually my wish to look at the creative responses of the so-called second generation to their complex family experiences seems to be a very rich cultural seam to tap. And that is very much, of course, what this evening's event is all about. So I think without further ado, let me just, more people, I'll leave them waiting for the moment. Let me just explain the plan of action for today. I think you all know the ropes pretty much by heart now as regards Zoom. If you could just ensure that you remain muted. The event is being recorded, so if you don't wish to be visible, you might want to turn off your cameras, but equally it would be nice to keep you all visible. It's a fairly small number of people, and I hope at the end will be plenty of time for kind of lively, more personal kind of interaction, albeit on screen. So we're going to start off with a fairly brief introduction from the two co-editors of the volume, which is the reason for this evening's event, the special issue of European Judaism magazine. They were also, though, the co-organizers of what, though I say it myself because I was also involved, was, I think, a wonderfully stimulating and successful, certainly very interesting online symposium that we worked on together and that took place under the auspices of the University of Leicester, where Imogen and Fransiska were both working at the time in May 2021. It seems a long time ago, doesn't it? But anyway, on the subject of so-called second generation visual artists working primarily in the UK, but also beyond these shores, as you will discover. So they're going to talk about the genesis of the project and the overarching themes and any other thoughts they might have by way of introduction. First Fransiska and then Imogen, and then we're going to hand over to three of the participating artists. We're going to start with Monica Petzal, and I think I've highlighted everybody for you to see who they are. Then moving to Judy Goldhill, and finally to Sara Davidmann. They will talk for a short time with particular focus on one key image and their take on it, their explanation, that's the word, of it and its context. And then I think we'll open things up. We'll see how it goes. As I think many of you will be aware, I like to sort of go with the flow, as it were, and be fairly pragmatic. I certainly have some questions and themes up my sleeve for discussion, but obviously we would very much appreciate your input. I can see from some of the familiar names in the audience that you yourselves, surprisingly, are also descendants of that first generation who experienced so very much. So your input, your questions, your comments, of course, will be more than welcome. So we will hopefully have some lively discussion towards the end. Very good. So I think without further ado, I'm not going to give formal, those rather officious introductions on this particular occasion because we have much to get through, much to be said, much to be discussed. So let me hand over first of all to Fransiska Louwagie, who is now at Aberdeen University. She's abandoned Leicester.
Thank you. Let's say, but thank you very much, Monica, for this introduction and for giving us the chance, of course, to present our publication today. I have the pleasure of giving a few words of context around the edited volume, and then I'll hand over to Imogen and also to our artist panel to go somewhat deeper into the content of it. In terms of context, I'd just like to acknowledge the origin of the publication very briefly. Obviously, Monica has just already touched upon that. And it is indeed a project that has taken place in several steps. The real starting point of everything that we'd like to acknowledge was an invitation for collaboration that came from Monica Petzal, who's also here today and who will speak later, as she was preparing her solo exhibition, Descent and Displacement at Leicester Museum in 2020. And Imogen and I, as Monica just said, were both employed at the University of Leicester at that time in history of art and in languages/Holocaust studies, respectively. And this was an opportunity really to bring together our interests at the intersection and the crossroad between memory studies, Holocaust studies, and the visual arts. And in collaboration with Monica and with the museum, we initially had the opportunity to organize a public seminar series. And so Monica Bohm-Duchen was one of the speakers there, also Michel Kishka, graphic novelist, and also Dr. Bea Lewkowski, so from the AGR Refugee Voices Testimony Archive. So it was a very interesting series. The exhibition was also very successful, and was then, of course, as you might have guessed from the date, interrupted to some extent by COVID. But that, in a certain way, was also an opportunity for us to reshape or reconsider the scope of what we were doing, because we were obviously observing that relatively little existed in terms of scholarly work on the art of the second generation specifically. It was still a kind of emerging field. And so the idea of a broader symposium emerged, and that's the symposium that Monica was just referring to. And in the context of COVID, we opted to have that as an online event, and that proved actually very fruitful and was a great opportunity to bring together speakers from different horizons, and also, involving speakers and an audience from further afield. Following on from the conference, we have been very lucky and very grateful that there was an immediate interest from the journal European Judaism to the publication. And so we obviously are grateful for their support of the focus that we proposed, and also for their willingness to discuss certain practical questions with us, quite important also in terms of color print and so on, which makes it a beautiful volume today, both online and in paper, as is fitting for a number on a thematic issue on the visual arts. As you will see from the publication itself and from today's event, the project has brought together a unique set of voices, we feel, so gathering perspectives not only from scholars but also from artists and from curators working in this field, and across different countries, including the UK, the Netherlands, Israel, and Canada. We've had the pleasure as editors, as co-editors, of framing and introducing 9 contributions, some very individual and some scoping the work of different artists. And this rich range of contributions allows us to engage with the key aim of the project, which, as I've briefly mentioned, was to address the kind of current gap around second generation visual arts in academia. And indeed, this body of work we felt has been explored much less than that of the first generation of artists who were emigrants to the UK, and also less than, for example, my primary area of research, which is literary work, including from second generation survivors, which is quite an established field of research in its own right. And what we have found highly interesting then from an interdisciplinary perspective is to see what the visual arts have in common with other second generation practices, and also to see what sets them apart and what makes them specific and unique. So the common point, the common starting point in a certain way has been the notion of post-memory, which most of you will be familiar with, coined by Marianne Hirsch, to refer to an inherited, that is to say a close but also indirect relationship to the past, a notion that has shaped much of the scholarship around second generation work, and also some of the practices that some of the artists refer to it in their own work. So Marianne Hirsch coined this notion for the second generation in the first instance. It has then been extended also to third generation practices, and also beyond that to other artists who engage with that memory in different ways. So the contributions to this volume show interesting connections with the broader field of post-memory, a number of commonalities, for instance, around the issues of memory transmission, also the attention to places, the attention to archives, the use of places and archives as possible connections with the past. And it has been particularly interesting to see how visual arts are employed to explore and to express these issues in a kind of specific manner. And Imogen will say more about that in a minute before we then also hand over to the artists. So in this thematic issue, these questions are then explored across a wide range of practices. So we're going from public memorials to photography and film, as well as painting, drawing, graphic novels, artist books, printmaking, sculptures, ceramics, mixed media installations, performance and participatory and site-specific activity. So a broad range of activities, and it's interesting to see those common threads that kind of run through them, and also see how these different media develop these in their own way. Before I hand over to Imogen to talk about that a little bit more, I just have the pleasure, if you bear with me one more minute, to thank a few people whom we really wanted to thank in relation for in the event and in the volume. So of course, everyone who took an active part in the seminar series and in the conference, and that includes the speakers I've already mentioned, also our keynote speaker at the conference, Dr. Glenn Sucho, our session chairs, in particular the late Dr. Jutta Vincent, to whom this publication is dedicated, also Dr. Judith Tucker, and our colleagues from the Stanley Burton Center for Holocaust and Genocide Studies at the University of Leicester. We are also very grateful to all peer reviewers for their time, as that is also an important step in shaping the volume, and as mentioned, to our editors at European Judaism, so in particular editor Jonathan McGonitt and also managing editor Jenny Peiser for their invaluable support and the help with all steps of the publication. So we are extremely pleased that the volume is now out online and soon also available in print. And as Imogen shares the cover with you and starts the PowerPoint presentation for the rest of today's event, I would also, last but not least, and very warmly like to thank and name all the contributors who are also listed on the cover. So we have Faye Ballard, Judy Goldhill, Lorna Brunstein, Joelle Cahen, Monica Bohm-Duchen, Rachel Dixon, Betsy Inlow, Monica Petzal, Elliot Moret Rosenberg, and Martin van der Heyden. And you will hear a little bit more about each of their contributions in the part that Imogen is about to cover. A particular thanks also to the artists who worked with our authors via interviews or via sustained exchanges, and this also includes Sara Davidmann, who we are also very grateful to have with us today for this presentation. In terms of access, the journal is available on individual and institutional subscription basis. Yeah, it will also so be accessible via G-Store. Individual articles can also be purchased online, and we can put the link to the publication in the chat. We have a number of limited hard copies as well, so just so that you're aware of that in case an issue is needed for review purposes, so you can also get in touch with us directly. That's just as a kind of practical information, and as you might also want to have a closer look at it. And I'll now hand over to Imogen, who will talk in some more depth about some of the themes I've just mentioned. Thank you.
Great, thanks so much, Fransiska. I'm just going to share my screen. Just bear with me 1 second. Hopefully you can all see that okay. So this is the front cover to the publication. So what I'm going to do now, very briefly, because I want us to move on to our artists, but talk about 3 or 4 of the kind of key themes that occur across the volume in relation to the ways that artists have engaged with understandings of the past, questions around displacement, memory, and identity. So one thing to mention first maybe is that for many of the artists in the publication, it was perhaps later on in their careers that they began to approach the subject of the Holocaust. So there's often a form of belated dealing with the past and with the relationships with the first generation, which might potentially be something we'll talk about later. So in some cases, this was prompted by the discovery of archival material or other kind of family records. In other cases, it emerged from maybe more institutional projects and prompts. So, for example, in the journal, Betsy Inlow talks about a 3rd-generation graphic novelist called Miriam Libicki. Libicki was invited to take part in a Holocaust educational project in Canada, and this led her to explore new strands of her Jewish identity. And to mention another example, which relates to what I'm showing on the screen, Iliad Murray Rosenberg, who is the curator at the Yad Vashem Museum Memorial, in her article focuses on the artist Sigalit Landau. And so for Landau, it was an invitation to contribute to an exhibition about children in the Holocaust that prompted her to make new sculptural work. And I'm showing you here work on the left, which represents a young boy playing with a dog, which for the first time directly addressed her father's experience of the Holocaust. And this gradually developed into a group of further sculptures with more perhaps sinister renderings of the figure and the dog, which Iliad shows in her text, kind of stages and explores complex intergenerational tensions between father and daughter. Another key theme that emerges is the use of archive materials as offering a kind of significant link to the past, and a particularly poignant type of material here is the use of family photographs, which have been conceptualized famously by Marianne Hirsch as, quote, points of memory. So this topic appears at several points in the article, but is addressed most directly by you, Monica Bohm-Duchen, in your article. So in her article, Monica analyses the use of family photographs and thinks here particularly about the kind of paradoxical relationship between photography and mortality. And one of the artists that Monica examines in this context is Sara Davidmann, and I'm showing you an example here on the screen, who we're looking forward to hearing from shortly. Artists also use other kinds of archival images, texts and objects, which often come from different sources. So I'm showing you here an example from Monica Petzal's printmaking, which combines wide-ranging images, which includes photographs of family members, other kind of family-owned objects, as well as other forms of text. So we're going to hear from Monica shortly, but just to flag that an important reference here in Monica's printmaking in this series, which she discusses in her article, are the diaries of Victor Klemperer. Another kind of example along this sort of lines then is focuses perhaps on different types of objects and their meanings, is the collaboration between artists Judy Goldhill and Faye Ballard, and their article describes how in their collaborations objects particularly take on an emotional resonance to deal with absence and silence, and again we're going to be hearing more from Judy shortly. So as well as kind of archives, another key theme that emerges is space, place and embodiment. And so what I mean by this is the way that physical space and place offer a tangible and powerful connection to the past. So in the visual arts, one way in which this is explored and mediated is through the genre of landscapes. And this is shown in the volume in Rachel Dixon's analysis of Ruth Ricks's painting, and I'm showing you just really briefly an example here, painted by Ruth Ricks, Crossing the Clearing, which Rachel discusses and analyses in her article. Notions of space and place, so we've seen there kind of in landscape painting, they're also central to more embodied types of art practice like performance and reenactment, and this is particularly the case with artist Lorna Brunstein, who in our volume is interviewed by curator Katie O'Brien. So I'm showing you here a photograph from her multimedia installation After Auschwitz, which was made in 2019. And this work really centres on the affective dimensions of place. So Lorna made this work following a visit to the death camp with her daughter and with members of the group Unite Against Fascism, the UAF. And what Lorna did was to develop a performance in which she repetitively worked with soil that she collected from the site, which you can see in the photograph in the image. So she sieved it, moved it through, rubbed it into her hands. So this is a kind of, an embodied confrontation with the earth. And in the article, Lorna talks about this as allowing a kind of proximity to those who perished, and at the same time an assertion of life. Final kind of key theme that I want to sort of mention then is that of memory transmission. So lots of the artists in the volume play roles in the construction of public or collective memory of the Holocaust. So in some cases, this is through designing public memorials, and this is something that Joel Kahn discusses in his article. He looks at different expressions of memory in public space in the Netherlands and the way that this has changed over time. And more generally, other artists undertake forms of public engagement and collaboration in connection with or adjacent to their artwork. So for example, in his article, Martin van der Heijden discusses his new museum in Amsterdam called the JOMA, where he delivers sessions on human rights education and citizenship studies. So that's a really brief overview of some of the key themes. So sort of drawing these together, what our volume does is show how post-memorial visual artists have taken up a range of different techniques and media to reflect on the tensions between past and present, and between absence and presence, and to explore connections with and between space and time. And a particular aspect that comes to the fore is how the artworks often engage and invoke the sensory dimensions of memory. So the artworks that we look at in the volume explore sight, but also sound and touch, and how these different senses can act as pathways to memory and processing. And so finally, what I just want to say is that the artworks also prompt viewers in different emotional, intellectual, critical ways, and this opens up ways to think about the relationships of second generation artists to the past, and then also at a wider level to think about contemporary understandings and remembrances of the Holocaust and its aftermath. So in the volume, what we want to do, as Fransiska said, is bring together different perspectives. And so we're really delighted tonight to have three practitioners joining us to talk about their work. So I'm very much looking forward to hearing from Monica, Judy and Sara. And I'm going to hand over back to you, Monica, as moderator. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Imogen. Now I'm just thinking we'll keep the PowerPoint running, I think, since the images that are going to be discussed are indeed already there. Imogen, I should just add, is currently at the University of Lincoln, so she too departed Leicester not so very long ago. But now I think indeed it's time to hear from the artists themselves, and we'll start with Monica Petzal, and we're going to be providing the websites to the links to the artist website, so I don't think I need to say anything by way of introduction. And of course the very reason they're here is to tell you something about themselves and their practice. So I think straight away let's hand over to Monica, and then it will be Judy Goldhill's turn, and last but not least Sara Davidmann. So I just noticed there are a number of people also who were involved with the volume in the audience, and indeed others I've encountered in different contexts. I would very much urge you, if you don't want to sort of put up a virtual hand later and actually talk, but that would be lovely if you would, but at the very least, do type in any comments and questions you might have in the chat as we go along and when the impulse takes you. So over to Monica Petzal, please.
Yeah, I'm unmuted, aren't I? Yeah,
yes,
right.
All good, thank you.
Hello, I can't see myself. Should I be seeing myself or not?
No, you don't see yourself. No, it's fine. We can see.
Okay, you. Good. Well, I shall fire away. Okay, well, I'm really delighted to be here this evening, both as a participant at the conference, one of the writers for the journal, and of course, because I had this exhibition at Leicester New Walk Museum, Descent and Displacement, which didn't quite have the run it deserved, but it did at least have something of a run. I was very interested to hear Imogen's comment about where one starts with archive. I inherited an enormous amount of archive from both my parents, who were German Jewish refugees, my mother from Dresden and my father from Berlin. But the genesis for this piece, in a way, was the diary of Victor Klemperer, which was, although it was published earlier in Germany, my German was not good enough to read it then, it was published in England in 1995. And reading it, I suddenly discovered a great deal about my grandparents and my mother that I did not know about. Now, when you read the actual article, you will see the detail of this relationship. But it led me to write the article which examined how important this relationship was. And it led to this piece which you are seeing on the screen. Now, I am a printmaker, and this is a large print. It is 1 meter high and 70 centimeters wide. And the way that I work is that I gather information together a bit like a storyboard for each image. And this image is the one in which I have an image of my grandmother, Sophia Zakowicz, and Eva Klemperer. This is Klemperer's wife, and she was a lady who had a great deal of trouble with her teeth. And my grandfather was a very well-known Jewish dentist in Dresden. And that was how the relationship started. And it had started previously, I found out, because my mother had been a student of Klemperer's. She had wanted to be a doctor, but being a doctor was not going to be able to happen under the Nazis. So she went to her next love, which was languages, and worked with Klemperer for a while before he too was dismissed from the university in Dresden. So in this image, we see my grandmother, with Eva Klemperer at a sort of key moment, which was probably 1934 to 1935, when my family were trying to flee Dresden. Klemperer had decided not to flee Dresden because his wife was an Aryan, and he thought in that sense he was protected. So Grandma Sophie is in the image, in the centre, driving a car, which was pretty unusual at that time. And what she is surrounded by are some of the papers and elements that were involved in going to England. To get to England, they had to list every single item they owned. And for every single item they owned, they were charged by the Nazi Party. In the top right-hand corner, you see correspondence with the Home Office in London. My grandmother very unusually spoke English, and she got herself on a train and a boat to England in 1935 to petition the Home Office so that my grandfather and her could come to England with their daughter, my mother, and that my grandfather would be allowed to work as a dentist in Britain without having to take any exams. The other items you see are some of the things that they had, well, they were able to bring along. We have Rosenthal china, we have fine crystal, we have Bauhaus furniture. So like many members of the bourgeoisie in Dresden, they were supporters of modern craftspeople, they were supporters of modern artists. They were great friends with the artist Konrad Felixmüller, and in my exhibition in Leicester, I was able to display that work. So this picture that you have in front of you is it's a kind of snapshot in itself of a particular moment in time, which brings together the life of my family and a little period in the life of the Klemperers. And that's my 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Monica. It's a challenge that you rose to admirably. I will pick up on many of the things you've said, I have no doubt. So I think probably Judy Goldhill next, please. Judy, are you ready to go?
Can you hear me now?
All good, all good.
Okay. So shall I start again? Because I just say how delighted I am to be included in this journal and to be able to present now. My story is slightly different. I've lived under the shadow of my family's wartime experiences, retold through anecdotal stories, and simultaneously experienced the trauma of my father's early death. My parents escaped Nazi Germany in 37 and 8 and settled in England. My mother fled from Nuremberg in 37 by Czechoslovakia, aged 10, and my father, aged 18, from Hamburg. My mother, who's still alive, aged 95, was so traumatized by the destruction of her comfortable life, which built a barrier of emotions she finds too painful to discuss. A wall of silence too agonizing for me to break. My father, Harold, served in the British Army, trained as an architect, and died of polio after spending 3 months encased in an iron lung when I was a baby. So I grew up without him, with a huge void in my life. And my understanding of him has been drip-feed of memory from my mother. They were only married for 5 years before he died. And strangely, I'm still trying to comprehend this. Why was it that only in my adult life did I begin to respond to the trauma of my father's death and absence? I had nothing from him. What took me so long? Is this part of the grieving process? I'm wondering if, in taking on my mother's narrative, it did not occur to me to think of my own subjective account. Compelled by the spirit of place and architectural edifices, I've had unique access to the restricted portals of the nuclear industry in the UK, and subsequently to major astronomical observatories in North and South America, exploring the ideas of making the invisible visible. Whilst photographing the skies and the machines that image the past, showing light from the dim and distant past, perhaps attempting to find my father. How do artists reckon the passing away of their parents? Asks art historian Davidmann. Perhaps, as in this case, and I quote, by inventing rites of mourning that are pictorial and which figure their own scenes and spaces of mourning that are quite other than established ones. Illumination and its absence plays its part. The black deltas and gulfs of interstellar space which figure in Goldhill's observatory and garden nocturnes are interrupted by lyrical lights and persons who question that spangled darkness, such as in her portrait, shown here, of the American astronomer Detrick. He appears to be dazzled and under pressure from cosmic light as his body twists in contortion while he tests lenses for viewing an annular eclipse against the sun's disk. Blinding white and dark perform as the dumb show setting of a celestial eyeball. In this picture, Goldhill seems to share the consequences of an embodied lunar and solar light, which alternately bleaches as well as fades and finally darkens the world, and those bodies portrayed within it, whether they be incidental persons or lost loved ones. Photography, intense looking, is crucial to me. I've always been an outsider, an observer, so working as a documentary photographer all my life has been a dream job for me. And this image, as it played out before me, was a gift, as I watched Detrick contorting his body to catch the beams of sunlight in the McMath Solar Telescope on Kitt Peak, Arizona, which was the first of my many artist residencies. In many ways, it's my favorite image, as it's all about looking, searching, seeing in all its iterations. Most astronomical observing is hard data, so for an outsider, hard, actually impossible to comprehend. But there were a few visual telescopes, particularly this futuristic solar telescope, which looks like a giant 7 on its side and something like out of a James Bond movie. All my residences were situated on the tops of sacred spots, like the Rockies, the Andes, and Mauna Kea in Hawaii. These beautiful buildings, sacred places, are built on magical ground, high on mountain plateaus in hallowed territories, a window to the world beyond, a key to our mysteries. The observatories containing telescopes, eyes, focus skywards, traveling deep through dark interstellar clouds to the coldest, oldest parts of the universe, to be able to gaze beyond the visible spectrum, between the infrared, microwave, and radio waves. Yet eyes are not cameras, simply recording what stands in front of them, writes Caroline Garland, curator and psychotherapist, in the catalogue Breathe that accompanied the exhibition I had with Faye Ballard at the Freud Museum, London. What we see is a complex business. It involves the mind and fantasy as well as the eye. What we see is made up in part of what is before our eyes, but also of its meaning, what the mind is attributing to and making of what is in front of it. So not surprisingly, we don't always see the same thing. Part of the complex business of looking and seeing contains the desire for possession, the idea by looking we can take something into ourselves, drink it in, or look one's film. The power of Goldhill's work demonstrates that she's occupied with the equipment for seeing as she is with the mysterious nature of what equipment sees. The mystery is part of the answer. Where is he? Where is she? Where does the lost person go when they can no longer be found in the world? It might just be possible to find them in outer space, perhaps a modern version of what some call heaven, as to find them in the relics of an earthy and domestic engagement with the world. A search through photography of mortality and, sadly, of absence. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Judy. And now over to Sara Davidmann. Oh, now we need to exit, don't we, Imogen? Are you going to be in charge of this and transfer over to the video? Lovely.
Hopefully it's ready now.
Yep, very good.
Can you hear me?
That's absolutely fine. Yeah.
Great, thank you. Before I talk, I'd just like to say a huge thank you to Monica, Imogen, and Fransiska for inviting me to be a part of this event. I'm going to show a video, which I'll be talking over, but I want to let it run for a very short while before I begin talking. So when Imogen has started the video, please don't worry if you don't hear anything. The video is completely silent. So Imogen, could we start the video? Thank you. The photograph that you see burning here is of my father's father, my grandfather, Leopold. I never met my grandfather. Leopold disappeared in the Shoah. I don't know what happened to him, or when or where he died, or how he died. In 2016, I began looking into my German Jewish family history. Until then, I knew very little about the German Jewish side of my family. My father had never been able to talk about his experiences growing up as a young boy in Nazi Berlin, or about the family he'd left behind when he was sent to Britain on the Kindertransport in 1939. Key to my project was the discovery of a family photo album which had been put together by my Aunt Susie, my father's sister. She had also been evacuated to Britain. Susie's daughter, my cousin Linda, inherited the photo album when Susie died, and Linda very generously lent me this photo album. The album was the beginning for me of discovering a family in Germany that I had never known existed. For over 5 years, I researched into my father's side of my family. At the same time as I was finding out about my family, and also finding out about what happened to individual members of the family in the Shoah, at the very same time as this, I made artworks. In my work, I use reproductions of family photographs from the album. I use blood from myself and from living family members. I use my own hair, and I use volatile materials such as fire, photographic chemicals, and bleach. And the works are quite physical and quite visceral. One of the artworks is named for my grandfather. It's titled For Leopold. And the video you're watching here is part of this artwork. For the work, I reproduced prints of family photographs to the same size as the originals. I then began to burn the photographs of people who had disappeared or who had been murdered in the Shoah. Originally, I'd intended to use burnt remains from burning photographs in an artwork. And in fact, I did do this in a separate artwork. But when I began to burn the reproduction photographs, watching them burn affected me so deeply. I knew that I just had to make videos as the photographs burned, as another piece. I was unable to control fire. And to me, this was an important part of this work, the fact that I couldn't control the fire. 10 videos then became an installation for a dark, silent space. 10 videos of 10 photographs burning. The videos run at the same time on 4 walls. As a viewer, you are surrounded by the videos of burning photographs. Each of the photographs burns slowly until all that is left is ash. And I'll let this video run to the end. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Sara. I think a lot of us will have reacted strongly, I have no doubt, particularly to that last work, and we'll obviously pick up on that. Let me now just spotlight all the participants, and we'll move into more general discussion if we may. Right. Hey, how are we doing? I'm just trying to locate everybody. Where have the others gone? Okay, fine. Right, so where to start? Perhaps rather than picking up on some of the issues and ideas that have already been mooted, however briefly, we should grab the bull by the horns, as it were, and actually tackle something that is implicit just by looking at us all, and also looking at the gender of most of the audience, and consider this question of gender. I mean, certainly in my researches, in my encounters with artists, and delving into this rich cultural field, it struck me again and again how the vast majority of us, whether academics or indeed practitioners, are women. And I think let's start there. I don't know, perhaps Fransiska and Imogen, you'd like to start with some thoughts on that, but then obviously we'd like to hear from the others as well. You'll need to unmute yourselves.
Thank you, Monica. I remember you raising that during your talk at Leicester when you were talking about different female artists, and I think the notion that you used was that of the memory candle. Is that right? Of women kind of perpetuating very often that family tradition. There are a couple of male artists mentioned in the volume as well. So on especially, of course, Moos is a very well-known example. There's also Michel Kiszka as a second-generation graphic novelist, and I know that we also have Maarten van der Heijden with us here today, who is also one of the artists and taking part in the volume and curator of the Joma Museum in Amsterdam, as Imogen briefly mentioned. But your observation still stands. It is very much a female landscape, and as a predominant practice, and in some cases also, and as Rachel Dixon shows, it's a mother-daughter relationship that is very central in the kind of artistic exchange that she described for Woodrick. So I would be interested to hear from the artists if that is something that has also been predominant for them. Of course, Judy mentioned her father, and I think Monica mentioned both her parents. I don't know if Imogen wants to add something before we hear from the artist panel.
Well, I suppose, Fransiska, more a question for you, given your work on literature and literary works, whether there's, I mean, this is kind of going maybe off the visual arts for a second, but just to think about whether that's something that you see in your work on literature. Is it different in writing, or are there kind of similar patterns, I suppose?
I think most of the writers I have worked on are male, and obviously then if I mention Art Spiegelman and Michel Kiszka, you could also put them on the literary side, because that they are at the intersection with graphic novels between both. I would say predominantly male, but I obviously work in French literature, so I don't want to speak for all literatures. Though maybe for the third generation, maybe that is shifting somewhat. I would think there are some third generation writers who are female as well, I've worked on, but there are examples of female writers as well, second generation, like Cécile Weisbrod in French. So it's a bit of a more mixed picture, perhaps.
Would any of the practicing artists like to comment on this? Obviously there are no hard and fast explanations, but I'm curious to hear your views on the subject. Yeah, Monica.
Well, I think it's a minefield, actually. I've been thinking about this. I am a printmaker, and I've also for a long time been involved in promoting women artists. And as a printmaker, which is a field largely dominated by women, I always think it is because it is a collaborative exercise very often, that we are sharing studios, we are sharing facilities, we are helping each other. It's very process-led. I'm also wondering whether some of the ideas around the collecting and the research and the sort of divergence, it's all about maybe women sometimes being more interested in being spread sideways than, this idea we have of ourselves sometimes, that we can be in the kitchen and we can be doing the cooking and we can be talking and we can be looking after the children at the same time. So that is probably a terrible thing to say, but it's somehow how I think about all these different processes that are going on, that we as artists, second generation artists, looking at our lives and bringing all these different strands together.
Sara or Judy, do you want to chip in at this point?
For me, I mean, as I was trying to get across about this kind of absence, and I've used a lot of archive material trying to find out about my father. I come from a matriarchal family. The mothers, I mean, my mother being still alive, and it's full of very strong women. So growing up without a father has had a huge impact on me. But I mean, as I said, the kind of drip feed of information about him from my mother has been kind of aided by my brother, actually, who directed me to the archive at Kew and to use other means of research, which I probably wouldn't have done. But it's quite, and also when I discovered my father, who was an architect, was actually interested in photography, I suddenly discovered that that I felt there was a kind of handing down across the generations, because I feel that I was quite isolated in my family, that none of the others have any kind of creative input into, apart from, as Monica just mentioned, about being in the kitchen and family and nurturing and all the the food and the gatherings. And I have huge family gatherings in my house. I have a massive family, so maybe it is that female lineage that we feel we have to pick up on. Sorry, that's very confused messaging going on, but it's the overwhelming feel of the female lineage in this situation, and the bearing and the holding of the memory as well. But that might be because I haven't had a kind of major male input from a father.
Sara, would you like to add to what's been said?
Yes, I think this is really interesting. I had never thought until we were talking just before this event started, and Monica, I think it was you were saying about how predominantly female we are at this event, and also in terms of second generation artists, there seems to be a sort of large proportion of them being female, and I hadn't realized this. I think maybe that's because I've come to this project quite late in life. It was only sort of 6 years ago that I started to work on this project. And I don't think I could have done it when my father was alive. And so I think for me, and also I took on from my father an avoidance of everything to do with the Shoah. So I really didn't know, strangely, very much about it. And I was teaching myself about the Shoah at the same time as I was learning about my family. So I haven't really had, until that point, any connection with second generation groups or second generation artists.
But actually that confirms what I think, I can't remember whether I think it was Imogen saying that actually in many cases, indeed, this kind of grappling with the past comes later in life, doesn't it? When the more immediate concerns of everyday life, are somehow put to one side. And that's, I think, significant, irrespective of your particular case. Martin, I didn't know whether they want to force it on you, but here you are as a male, as a non-UK based artist. Martin works in the Netherlands. I wonder whether you'd like to say anything at this point. You need to unmute yourself, of course, and I can highlight you if you would like, but no pressure.
No. Yeah.
Okay,
I think it's rather difficult to say something about it. I mean, Boaz Arad is an Israeli and second generation artist who I admire very much. I have him I have him also in my museum, the Yoma. So I don't know what to say. I can add that when I in my youth read these papers of my grandmother, and you had to fill in these little lists about how you feel, there came always as a result that I was rather between male and female, you know. So maybe I'm not so. Yes, I'm totally male, of course, but I don't know. I cannot say any verstandige dingen. Hoe zeg je dat? Any intellectual.
Yeah.
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 About this subject,
Yeah.
female or male. I don't know.
I have one thought, at least, that I'd like to share on that topic. I mean, you know, as we all know, yes, of course, there are male artists doing very interesting work. And, you know,
Yeah.
you mentioned Glenn Suha,
Yeah.
for example, who took part in the original symposium. And I'm thinking also of David Broyer-Weil, also based in this country, who does extraordinarily complex, multivalent, sort of monumental canvases where the Holocaust and his own family's experience of it is there, but embedded in many other things besides. But it seems to me that what actually unifies most of the people who have contributed to this project is this kind of almost obsessive homing in on the family. And, you know, again, I balk at making gender, you know, generalizations or stereotypes, but there is something pretty fundamental. I think it is the women who give birth. I mean, I'm going to probably be sort of gunned down for this, but this sort of extraordinarily kind of basic fundamental sort of position of the woman in relation to the family, and indeed on the back of that, the bearer and the perpetuator of memory and of generational memory. I mean, surely there's something there. I'm not saying that's the whole explanation, but surely there is something there. Sarah, you're nodding. I hate to generalize, and yet I find myself doing so. And indeed, maybe now is the time to invite any members of the audience to contribute. I noticed Caroline Pick again. I don't want to put anybody in on the spot, but Caroline's a very interesting filmmaker. I wonder, Caroline, whether you'd like to say something, or indeed Jenny Kagan, who I notice is also in the audience. But as I say, no pressure at all. But if you'd like to chip in at this point, you'd be most welcome.
Okay, can you hear me?
Is that Caroline?
I suppose if you think of major 20th century artists like Christian Boltanski or Anselm Kiefer, I feel very reluctant to sort of say this is women's territory, really, and that surely what we should be celebrating is the fact that these are very individual stories, and we all make our art in a very individual kind of way. And so I hate to sort of reduce it to the essential thing of womanhood or what is our nature in some way. I just think we should celebrate these amazing stories that people have suffered through and come through in some way by making a work that is explicable for other people.
But again, I mean, Christian Boltanski is obviously a major influence, for example, in the work of Lorna Brunstein, who's actually, I think, not with us tonight. You know, he's clearly one influence among many. But again, it's not his family he's focusing on. Do you see what I'm getting at? That is actually this focus on our family, my family, that perhaps sets the women's work apart. But let's leave it at that. I think, unless Jenny Kagan, would you like to say anything, or indeed anybody else? And Jenny, please remind me to ask you at the very end to say something about your interesting new project up in Huddersfield. We mustn't forget that.
Yeah, I'd love to. I'm actually driving at the moment, which is why I'm going to be quite silent. But I will hopefully by the time we get to the end of the discussion of parks, it'll be much safer to drive. They're much safer to talk.
All right. We'll look forward to that. Very good. Picking up on something that I think, Sarah, you said just a few minutes ago that you couldn't have done the work that you've been doing had your father still been alive. This is significant, I think, isn't it? That actually it's only perhaps, I'm throwing this out as something to discuss, is it perhaps only with the passing, I mean, quite literally, the death of a parent who has been silent about certain important aspects of their past, that we are liberated to start confronting it head on? I mean, clearly, not all families have been silent to the same extent, but certainly in my case, and I think, Sarah, you certainly have felt this, but, the word silence, silences, yes, sort of eloquent silence, deafening silence, and this is a motif, this is something that comes up again and again, I've found. What are your thoughts about that? Yes, of course.
For me, it's the opposite, true. I think there was much silence in our family, of course, but I think it's a very pity that my mother and my father in a less degree maybe, but my mother was a psychoanalytic psychotherapist, and I'm very, she would have liked my work and that I do what I do very much, I think. She brought me when I was when I was in my 30s. We went to the first exhibition about second generation, and then at that time I thought it was all nonsense. I thought it was not about me at all. So it was pure resistance, and so I think that all these artworks are coming, and my whole project with that museum here downstairs, she would be very proud of it, I think. And it's a pity. I hope she will see it from the heaven where she is.
That's not quite the same thing, if I may say so, because clearly we're all doing what we do in some profound way for our parents or grandparents, as the case may be. But
yeah,
our relation to them and their histories while they're alive has to be very different to what happens when they're gone. And Judy, I wonder if I hope you won't mind if I ask you this, but I wonder, looking forward, you know that I've just lost my own wonderful mother, the photographer Dorothy Bohm, at a very ripe old age. Your mother is also clearly approaching the end of her life. I mean, you don't have to answer this if you don't want to, but I wonder whether you envisage that your work might fundamentally change once she has gone.
So it's an interesting point. I mean, I often think about it because I'm so busy looking for clues about my father, of which she finds so difficult to talk about. And I think I've got my mother here, and I've got and I do quiz her quite a lot about her memory, and she gets quite annoyed with me actually about how could she possibly remember? It was 70 years ago. How could she remember? And in fact, there was one. Well, actually, I won't go into details about it, but it was, it's a very good point. I don't know how you feel, Monica, about, do you want to make work about your mum now, or, think of her in a different way?
I'm certainly, I mean, it's very much a transitional phase. This is all a very new situation.
Sure, of course.
That I will be making discoveries as we dismantle her house. And Sarah, I think you experience exactly that. What are we going to find, which might actually quite dramatically shift our view of what our parents' lives were all about.
Can I bring something in? I was just thinking about the idea of repair, which is what I think was quite central to my work. And maybe repair is something that comes to us later in life, that the work I made about my mother and about Dresden was very much about sort of repair work. And it's been also meant that I've become involved with a charity called the Dresden Trust, which involves acts of reconciliation between Britain and Dresden. But I was really only able to make it at quite a late stage. I did go with my mother to Dresden in 1986, and it was the most traumatic visit of her life, and in a way it led to her death. And it took me an awful long time after that to think that I could do anything about Dresden. But the act of, in a way, making a repair was a very strong one, and I wonder if that resonates with anyone else. The other thing I was going to say is that last September, I and my family laid Stolpersteine for my father's family in Berlin, and that was also an act of repair, which I have made a film about.
Sarah, go ahead.
I really am interested in this idea, Monica, of an act of repair, because that really is central to the project about my family, except that it was a different kind of act of repair, because my father had been a very difficult man, and he was a paranoid schizophrenic. And I began this project because I wanted to understand things that might have affected my father when he was being brought up as a young Jewish boy in Berlin, because there had been psychiatrists who said it was, that those experiences were to do with what happened to him later in life when he became a schizophrenic. And for me, my project was very much about trying to, maybe repair isn't the right word, but develop a sort of relationship with my father and an acceptance that I'd never had when he was living. And it did that for me. It did repair my feelings about my father and what I would see as a dysfunctional relationship. It did repair that for me. So it's a different kind of repair, maybe.
Fransiska.
Yeah, I think it's a very interesting notion, and maybe somewhere it hovers a little bit sometimes from the practices we have observed. And again, we have to be careful with generalizations, but it's, you know, what we can say can be valid for a couple of people or artists rather than for everyone. But in some cases, it might also hover between repair and emancipation. I think in the case of Lorna Brunstein, there was also the struggle with the father's presence, which was at times quite oppressive, and you know, the impact on the life. And I'm also thinking again of Michel Kishka, and for those of you who don't know the work, I'll just put the link in the chat to his graphic to his blog and his graphic novel, which has also just been turned into a film. In his case, he also comes from a family situation where the father was entirely silent during his youth, where there were many references, and it was a very oppressive presence, but a silent one. And then the father becomes this public witness of the Holocaust after his brother's suicide, and that kind of triggered the father to become a constant witness of the Holocaust, with visits to Auschwitz, with visits to schools, and that was something that the son found hard to accept, that there was this public narrative but never a private one. And then the graphic novel is the subtitle of it is Things I Never Told My Father. And in that case, also going back maybe to the question of repair and the different levels of repair, he felt it was very important, also going back to Monica's question, to publish it just, you know, before his father died, also as a way of re-establishing a certain dialogue and the reconciliation in that respect, maybe also accepting, you know, that public witness status had eventually been a positive thing for his father, but also then trying to show what the impact had been on him, and kind of as a second generation person finding his own voice. In an interview that we did with him, he very interestingly said that he felt like his father's Pinocchio, like had always had to live up to what his father had expected, and that, you know, him as his revenge in a way on Hitler. So it's those intergenerational dynamics, and I think they can evolve maybe between different stances of repair and emancipation and reconciliation, depending on how the parents have acted and how the children have reacted, maybe.
I was actually going to end by asking what sounds like a rather facile question, but since you've actually introduced this notion of what your art is doing, what's it for, maybe, you know, with this issue of repair, maybe we can actually broaden it out and ask all of you, including Caroline, perhaps, you know, what is it that drives you to make this work? What are you expecting its outcome, its result, its effect to be, both on your, you know, for yourself, but for those looking, and indeed for your own children, if you have any? I mean, these are very, very big questions, but I would be curious to hear the answers. Caroline, do you want to? Yeah.
I think you feel compelled at a certain point to do the work. And I think particularly, as in my case, it was a story of silence. It's like you're giving words that they couldn't speak or wouldn't speak to you. So your words are their words in a way, or giving them a voice.
Judy, would you like to say something?
Yes, I mean, I very much like what Monica said about repair, because I knew so little about my dad. He was 34 when he died. It's a compulsion to find out more and to discover more and to keep asking questions. And because as we know, you know, everyone is dying and family members have died and so there's no time like the present. And it's about whether your individual search has a universality about it. And I think this thing about absence and not having anything, and looking for meaning, particularly in archive material, has been crucial for me, and fascinating. And as an artist, how you make that into a kind of a universality. So it's from the specific to a much broader theme.
I think we only need to look at the cover of today's newspaper and what Diane Abbott said to see that anti-Semitism is on the rise, or Jew hate, as I now prefer to call it in a way. And that one of the things for me that looking at the history constantly reminds us is that we, or I feel that I have a task to do today, not just. And I'm slightly struggling about whether I make art for exhibition. I've just recently made a film, and Descent and Displacement also exists as a kind of book stroke catalogue. And I'm constantly questioning which way is going to be most effective to allow people to understand the history and to make it relevant to what's going on today, which, you know, continues to be so awful.
Which perhaps should bring us to a more detailed discussion of the differences between your practice, and particularly pertaining, I think, to the use of photography, which is something I'm particularly interested in, because, you know, it's fairly obvious, Monica, you have, I won't say didactic, that's not the right word, but you know what I mean. You have a sense of mission. You are using photography and, of course, archival and other material in a very conscious sort of way. Judy, your approach is entirely different. It's more oblique. You know, maybe we can say more about that. And Sara, of course, as evidenced by that extraordinary clip you showed us, you are doing things to family photographs, which are, I think, necessarily shocking, but of course, intentionally so. And I wonder if the three of you might like to comment on the way you perceive photography, you know, and its function in what you yourselves produce.
Can I? I'd also like to say, as well as using fire, I mean, I've used other physical elements such as blood from living family members and my hair. And I think an important thing for me about the work has been about placing myself in connection with this history. And I think that, you know, it's like, as second generation, as third generation, as I feel that we live with that history in a sense. I don't know if that makes any sense to anyone else, but for me, the physical aspect of the work and putting myself in it was important.
I mean, one of the things that really intrigues me about your work, Sara, is that it is intensely visceral. I don't know if the rest of you have seen other examples. You should look at Sara's website, but those extraordinary, luridly coloured, microscopic images of blood, you know, sort of just extraordinary and very different, I think, to what anybody else is doing at the moment in this context. But it's so intensely visceral, intensely physical, and yet also deeply conceptual. And it's that sort of clash, if you like, that sort of creative tension between the two, which I find very, very powerful. Can you say a little bit more, Sara, though, about this decision that you made to actually physically burn, obviously not the unique photographs, but nevertheless, yes?
Yes, I mean, I found it quite problematic early on, the thought of burning photographs. And I must say that they aren't the actual photographs. They are reproductions of the photographs made to the same size. I mean, to me, there seems to be something really dreadful about burning them. I think what moved me so much when I was first doing it was watching the photographs burn was like watching the people burn. And it affected me so deeply. I mean, things that affect me in a bad way like that draw me to them to work with, as much as things which affect me in an opposite way, which are things I would consider to be of beauty, that draw me equally. And I think to do with the burning, in the end, I just felt that for me, and I can't talk about anyone else because I don't know how other people respond to the work, but for me it just seemed so relevant. Such terrible, terrible things had happened, you know, and that I suppose I felt that burning the photographs was so little in comparison, but for me, that burning process had something of the loss of the horrendousness of what had happened to the people in the photographs.
I'd be very curious to know from members of the audience what their response was, particularly to Sarah's work, because it is shocking, isn't it, what you do, and you're obviously aware of the complexity of what what you've decided to do there, or indeed Fransiska and Imogen, whether you'd like to comment on Sarah's strategy. Because for many of us, as we know, they're the precious family album often found after a parent's death, often tiny little images, very few of them, certainly in my family's case, and I know it to be a common thing, so precious, and you're burning them. And it's got the reference, obviously, to the fire of the Shoah itself. But they're also very beautiful, aren't they? I mean, I think everybody would agree with me that there's a certain kind of hypnotic quality, particularly when you see the installation that you alluded to that was on display at the Four Corners Gallery a few years ago. Quite extraordinary. You cannot fail to be mesmerized by the visual, the visuality of the work. Would anybody in the audience like to comment here? If you were shocked, don't be afraid to say so, because I think that's part of what we need to be talking about here. Or Caroline, perhaps. I don't know whether you're familiar with Sarah's work before, but how you reacted to it.
I'm afraid I'm not that familiar with Sarah's work. I just wondered, is there of course it was very moving and beautifully done, but is there another way of looking at fire as somehow giving some quality of something new can come out of it after a fire?
Absolutely, there is also, absolutely, yes. Fire has renewing properties, yeah. And of course, it's something that's beyond us as human beings, in a sense, beyond our control.
The phoenix rises from the flames, I seem to remember in mythology. Absolutely. So many strands coming to bear there. I think that somebody called Renee has her hand raised. Renee, would you like to?
Yes, that's me. Thank you. I visited Auschwitz recently, just last month, and images that I had in my mind, Sarah's kind of brought them to life, and it was almost as poignant watching this as being there. I found it very, very powerful.
Thank you. I also visited Auschwitz and took photographs there. I spent 3 days there. It was a horrendous experience, but I haven't been able to do anything with the photographs. But thank you for your comment.
Perhaps that brings one to Judy's very different approach, which is much more elusive, oblique, and indeed, if one saw your very interesting work out of context, you wouldn't necessarily make the connections that we are, positioning the work in today.
Because my work was very much focused on my father, and because he died, which is kind of a tiny fraction of what Sarah's talking about, that he died in an iron lung, and he was in an iron lung for 3 months. And my mother mainly talked about her memory of that and the horrendousness of it. But actually, I'd never actually encountered an iron lung. And I tracked one down when I was working on this exhibition at the Freud Museum, and photographed an iron lung. And I tried to, I mean, in the viscerality of it, and that I actually kind of climbed inside it. I tried to defy it, because it actually is a machine that obviously aided people to breathe. And I wanted to some kind of connection to him, and a kind of visceral way to try and connect with that. And then I photographed an iron lung with a kind of light coming from it, as almost like a kind of rocket, or a kind of envelope of hope, so that I could use photographs in that way of kind of showing, again, it's probably absence, death, a kind of obfuscation of reality and my reality, but also about fear, of how you can confront fear and try and deal with it in your own way. And I feel grateful that photography enabled me to do that. In fact, I mean, my sister, who I'm very close to, found it quite overwhelming, that she and said, you know, how lucky I was to be able to actually do that, or kind of come up with that idea, because in some way it helped with the grieving process, which obviously I'd never done because I was 12 months old when he died. So it's become a kind of a lifelong grieving in some way of absence, but photography enabled me to do that.
Monica, do you want to add anything about your use of photographic material in particular?
I don't think I do. I mean, I have, I'm very fortunate that I have got a very large archive of family photographs. There are a great many albums, and I also have a great many possessions that I photographed. And one of the things I enjoyed doing at Leicester was actually able to take the actual objects in, and not only the photographic evidence of them. So maybe I'm in a slightly different position in that I was very fortunate that there really was quite a lot of material to work from.
That is, I think, quite rare, isn't it? Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Jenny Kagan has just sent a message, I think, to everyone saying she's now parked safely and would like to say something. Jenny, perhaps you can just tell us briefly about yourself for those of you who haven't encountered your work. Let me.
Yes, if I can find the unmute button. Have I found it effectively?
Yes, it's absolutely fine.
Excellent. Yes, I mean, I'm very interested in the conversation about this moment in time, and Monica, it's particularly salient for you at the moment of losing that generation and losing our parents. I've made work about my parents' stories, and I started that work quite tentatively when my mother was still alive. But it was really only when she died that I felt I had the agency to take that story for myself. And I think it's a really key moment now as we're losing that first generation, and how we transition and how we use their stories in new ways and take hold of them ourselves. Apart from, I mean, I make work about my own family story. I do installation work, which Monica has seen. But I'm also involved in an organisation called Holocaust Centre North, which has an exhibition based at Huddersfield University, a permanent exhibition. And the exhibition was founded on the basis of telling the story of the Holocaust through the eyes of the survivors. And it was founded by survivors. And we're now at the point where we are losing, and we have a very, very small handful of the original founding survivors still with us. And so the organisation has been looking for new ways to continue the work in the spirit of the foundation of telling through the eyes of the survivors. And what we've started to do is to invite artists to come and explore our archive and to respond to it. And we're just in the first year of this initial 3-year programme, although we already have funding for a further 3 years. It's been very enthusiastically received. A general call out went out. We had 100 artists respond. The first 3 are about to deliver their first series of work. And it's about conversation between archive and artists. So it does 2 things. It allows a new language to emerge from the archive, but it also invites people to donate their archive to somewhere that's actually going to bring them to life. So we're excited about that work, and the early signs are really enthralling, the work that's emerging.
100 artists submitted. That's quite extraordinary. Do you have a sense of how many of them had a direct personal connection to all this terrible history?
It was interesting. It was a mix, and some responded to the themes of oppression and exclusion. There were artists from other excluded groups that responded quite a lot. Some academics. It was a real mix. I mean, I was astonished by the caliber and the knowledge of the respondents. So one of them is a German academic. One of they're internationally based, and actually we're talking about extending the programme to cover literature in coming years as well. it's the website is Holocaust Centre North. Do have a look. If you want to message me about it and engage with me about it, I'd be really happy to talk to anyone about it.
If you have a chance just to perhaps copy and paste the link into the chat.
Yeah, I will. No, somebody's done it. Thank you.
Taken. Very good.
Excellent. Thank you.
Thank you
not
so much.
easy from the car.
I'm aware of time running short now, but maybe actually, since you mentioned extending the Huddersfield project to the realm of literature, maybe this is a good place in which to come back to what Fransiska was touching on earlier, and to actually consider the differences between what the visual arts can do. And we haven't really talked about film versus the still image at all. We might perhaps briefly discuss that, but Fransiska, you are a literary person perhaps at heart, or certainly in your original your core work. Would you like to perhaps offer some comments about some of the, again, at the risk of generalizing, but some of the fundamental differences that you have perceived perhaps in what words can do by themselves and what the visual can achieve?
So in second generation work, there are very interesting commonalities, but what certain second generation writers have done with what we call in French the enquête, so the kind of investigation, the family investigation. So what you mention in a way, but they kind of describe the process, and very often also describe the finding of absence. They go all the way and dig deeper, and then rather than restoring or finding the narrative, they also have to describe the ongoing gaps and kind of how they deal with these. So it's also the notion of trace is very important. So the traces that they find, very often these also involve some language traces, so how they deal with multilingual elements like Yiddish in their writing. So that there's a kind of multilingual dimension to that as well. So there are different touching points. So the role of places, a lot of, including non-second generation, but also fiction about the Holocaust, for instance, often starts from a place, and then that leads to an investigation. So that kind of the idea that space can kind of bridge in a way the gap with the past, or is an entry point to the past, is something that is explored very much in literature. And for me, it's been really interesting to see how this shapes out very differently, despite the kind of common roots in the visual arts, the attention to landscape that Imogen mentioned. Also, the embodiment, the visceral is very, an interesting contrast as you work with different materials, as opposed to the words that we have in literature, and how that shapes up. It has been.
Oh, you've frozen.
It's recurring as well, but it takes on different shapes. And there's also going to be a conference in June in France. So, sorry, am I breaking up?
You're breaking up a little bit, but I think it's okay now. Carry on. Yeah.
Oh, that's fine. Yeah, no, sorry. I was going to say there's also a conference in June that kind of takes the stance of looking how literature has influenced this second generation art. That's a conference in Paris. So it's interesting to see how the dialogue is also established between the media, which is maybe something that is also a new way of looking at things.
Interesting. I mean, you talked about landscape, space, place, journeys, and I noticed that I think Dave Clark is in the audience, who's one of the editors of a book all about this really quite widespread and recurrent phenomenon of people like us, most of us in the virtual room today, feeling compelled to go back to those places of origin in the illusory hope ultimately of finding something to hold on to. And I wonder if I might end by quoting somebody who hasn't been mentioned today, but whose work I respect, indeed mentioned in my own piece in the new volume, Ardin Halter, who's the son of survivor artist and architect and indeed writer Roman Halter. And he's written a new book called The Fire and the Bonfire, which I highly recommend. It's a very eloquent set of ruminations, reflections on the complexity of being second generation. It's a really important read, I think. But he says at one point, and I might be paraphrasing ever so slightly, but I think it might be quite a good point at which to end. He says something like, I am troubled by art that is not troubled by its own endeavor. And it seems to me that that captures very brilliantly the paradox that we are all in search of something, whether it's repair or liberation of some kind, and yet it's ultimately a journey doomed to failure. We are never going to find total closure. But of course, I think that consciousness of the impossibility of what we're up to, and yet the compulsion to keep on trying, is actually what makes so much of the art so very powerful. Does that sound very pretentious? It probably does, but I hope that's a thought-provoking point at which to end. It is nearly past, and I imagine stomachs are beginning to rumble and so on and so forth. So unless anybody else has any last-minute thoughts, both from the audience or in the panel here, do we wrap it up with much to ponder and to continue to think about? Good, we've got some nice comments coming in. Hopefully you've all had a chance to copy the web links. If anybody hasn't and wants more information, then do get in touch via the Insiders Outsiders Festival website. What else to say? I mean, perhaps worth mentioning that Sara Davidson, I think I mentioned the excellent exhibition you had at Four Corners in East London, but she is working towards another exhibition at the Wiener Library. When is that going to be? Not just yet, but...
we're planning it for around Holocaust Memorial Day 2025, so it's quite a long time.
But of course, actually, the context in which work is shown is crucial. Four Corners is a photography gallery, East London, the Wiener Library is something very different, so that's also something I think to throw into the mix. And I don't know, Monica, Judy, Caroline, Jenny, whether you'd like to mention any forthcoming projects of your own.
I have a film which I made with Eileen Herring-Woods, which is now on my website, monicapetzal.com, and I'm doing a webinar, I think it's called, on the 11th of May with Michael Newman of the Association of Jewish Refugees about that, and I will put that up on my website.
And Judy?
Well, I'm in the middle of Wales, actually working on another exhibition, which actually is called Darkness, but actually it'll be about dark skies, and is being funded by the Brecon Beacons, which I don't know how to pronounce now because they changed their name. So that's going to be in November for the Autumn Hay Festival at Hay Castle, and it'll be on for 3 months.
Excellent. And just for those of you who don't know Caroline Pick's work, Home Movie, I think I'm right in saying, Caroline, is probably the most pertinent. And is it available to watch online, or would people have to get in touch with you to watch it?
It is online. In fact, it was just shown at the Towner in Eastbourne this week to an audience.
Yeah.
It's on my website. If you don't have the password, it's Good Film 2020.
Oh, Good Film 2020, very good. And I should just also add that I had the good fortune to, well, in fact, both to meet Jenny unexpectedly, but to see her incredibly complex and powerful multimedia installation actually in Kaunas, where her parents survived the war in hiding. And again, it was shown, wasn't it, Jenny, initially in the north of England. So the impact it has in the town where these events happen clearly is very different indeed. And Martin, I don't know if you'd like to tell us anything about your future plans by way of conclusion. You're muted at the moment.
Just to say, while Martin's Martin's unmuting the next iteration.
Yes, everyone is invited. I'm always Thursday, Friday, and Saturday from 11 till 5. My museum is open. Even kijken, is this something?
Very good. I think we've provided the link to that as well. Thank you very much.
You can see it on my website, Yoma Amsterdam. Anyhow, it's in my contribution of the book.
Very good. And Jenny, you were about to say something about future plans?
I was about to say, if I'm still unmuted, I was about to say future iterations of Out of Darkness are all planned for overseas, but perhaps this group might be interested in Cantata, which was another project in Kaunas, which was dealing with testimony, and I'll pop the link for that video, which is a project, was a performance project done with the South African composer Philip Miller, based entirely on testimony, featuring several hundred performers, which we also did as part of Cannes 2022. And we now have an English language version of that. So I will pop that in the text, in the chat.
Wonderful. So much to look forward to, much to ponder. Thank you very much, everyone, for being with us tonight. And the event has been recorded and will be available on the Insiders Outsiders YouTube channel within the week or so. So do tell other people about it if they would be interested. And Fransiska, Imogen, I don't know whether you'll be posting it on your own various networks, but anyway, Insiders Outsiders.
Very happy, and also massive thanks from us to everyone on the panel and in the audience. It's been great to have your contributions and a great discussion.
Thank you very much, above all the participants, but to the audience as well. Thank you very much for being here. And all the very best.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you so much.